Self-knowledge and the destruction of ignorance. If one knows the self, nothing else is, and nowhere else is. If the self is not known, there are as many things and realms of experience as one imagines to be. Multiplicity of states appears only so long as ignorance is conjured. With the dawn of knowledge, they vanish away, like darkness in light. Dreams at night's end, the unreal into the real. In truth, only one state is, natural and innate. No realms or things, no dream and its images, no shadows or illusions. Their birth and their death, for the one state is being just as it is. If ignorance vanishes, if one knows the self. Knowledge is constant, as being ever is. When knowledge is constant, so is its bliss. With ignorance, a life of happiness is impossible. With self-knowledge, profound wisdom, ignorance is impossible. There is never a good moment to dwell in ignorance. Never an appropriate time to suffer or believe in the unreal. Dualism is required for one to feel fear. Non-dual is the self, its bliss and its being, never ceasing, not decaying, and never destroyed. Reality is non-dual. Dualism is false. Belief in duality yields a stormy ride on a calm sea, a nightmare when quietly in bed, disquietude when everything is fine, a corner in the infinite, death in the eternal, the unreal in the real. Knowledge depends not on time or on place. No need to wait. To know one's own self. Death differs not from life. If dreaming alive, one dreams in death. If awake to the self, there is no life or death, no being as it ever is. Consciousness as knowledge itself. Blissful immortality is yours when this imperturbable self is realized and this knowledge is constant. To know the truth of one's own self is the one way to be liberated from all ignorance, its delusion of bondage, and its consequent suffering. Ignorance is merely an inverted view of the one ever same existence, an inverted attempt to know the reality of the self. Ego is the self seen unclearly. Realization is knowing the non-existence of the ego. Liberation is freedom from the notion that there is bondage. To destroy bondage, destroy ignorance. To destroy ignorance, destroy the ego. To destroy the ego, know the self. To know the self is to know the truth. Bondage is not real, but only imagined. Bondage is ignorance, only misidentification. The more one examines ignorance, the less one finds of it. With the bright light of knowledge, examine all shadows, and all will be light. Misidentification alone is ignorance. Ignorance alone is bondage. Bondage alone is suffering. Knowledge of the self alone destroys them all. You bond yourself. You liberate yourself. You conjure imagination, and your inquiry destroys it. Relinquishing the false and knowing the true are simultaneous and experienced as one. Like the fear of the snake, where there is only a rope. Bondage is not real, but only imagined. Knowledge is singular, ignorance twofold. Veiling is one aspect, making the real seem unreal, the ever-existent absent. Differentiation is the other, projecting the unreal into itself, creating details of illusion so empty, like the waves of the water, seen in a mirage. Ignorance has neither power nor substance of its own, but borrows, as it were, the reality, identity, and happiness of the self, to make the unreal seem real, the never-existent as being. Such is the effect of ignorance, the illusion of veiling and projected multiplicity. The result of knowledge is being unhidden, undivided, transcendent of all name and form. Ignorance conceives itself dually, as I and as this. Knowledge reveals no I and know this: indivisible being, alone as existing, one with knowing, for knowledge is singular. There is no cause of illusion, for illusion is unreal. For an unreal effect, there cannot be a real cause. Causality itself is illusory. Illusion itself is illusory. The reality alone ever is. There is no cause of illusion. Being consciousness bliss should be known just as it is. Superimposition on being, the ego seems existent. Superimposition on consciousness, the ego seems a second knower. Superimposition on bliss, happiness seems as if external. Go back the way you came, to abide free of delusion, with no superimposition, egoless, conceptless, attachmentless. Abide as that as it is, the eternally unmodified, with no attribute or quality, no form and no name, which should be known just as it is. Being consciousness bliss. Inquire, who am I? To know the one self. Who could be ignorant? Who could be bound? Know the one self, and abide free and happy, with no ignorance to veil, no bondage to suffer. The self-evident is known by the self itself. To know the one self, inquire, who am I? Knowledge of reality destroys that which has no real existence. Reality is never destroyed, for the real ever is. The unreal is not destroyed, for it never came to be. Knowing that the real ever is its realization. Knowing the unreal never is its destruction. That which has no real existence is destroyed by knowledge of reality. The realization of the self. Absorption in Brahman is the knowledge of that which always alone is. There is no division of this state and that state. One state alone ever was, is, and will be. There are no degrees or phrases of self-realization. Without variation is the non-dual truth. As the real ever is, and the self is never other, that which is realized at the end is actually always present. The self has no other state, mode, or condition. The natural, innate state is simply being as it is. The self has no unenlightened state of bondage. How then can there be enlightenment or liberation for the self? Ever self-luminous and ever free. The knowledge of that which always alone is absorption in the Absolute, the realization of the self. The time for liberation is always, for the reality of being is always. The time for knowing the self is always. To be realized now is to find oneself realized throughout all three times. The self is not of the past, present, or future. Realization is not of the past, present, or future. The real self is. The three times are not. Enlightenment is timeless, neither gradual nor sudden, for the self is not measured in time or space. Realization is timeless, not an event, with no beginning or end. Timeless truth realized timelessly. Truth of the self, self-realized. Liberating truth, timelessly so. Always, always is the time for liberation. When the self knows itself, reality comprehends itself with all comprehensive knowledge, for it alone is infinite and solitary. To know the self as it is to know God as God is. The self knows itself by its own light. God sees God with God's own eye. Self-knowledge is devoid of subject and object. Knowledge free of subject and object. The division unreal is alone true knowledge. This is supreme knowledge, beyond knowledge and ignorance, in which they appear, in which they disappear. That which is beyond knower, knowing, and known. With all comprehensive knowledge, reality comprehends itself, for it alone is, when the self knows itself. Of the full and perfect is the knowledge full and perfect. The realization of the Absolute is not a partial knowledge, as if the Absolute were one thing among many, but a full knowledge of that which alone is. If there is I, knowledge is limited. The mirror image of that I, which contains within itself the knowing and known, in true knowledge, no division exists. Essence is all, and the perfect fullness of reality is that of the self. Supreme knowledge is reality, the self's knowledge of itself, full and perfect. The knowledge full and perfect is of the full and perfect. Other than the self, what is there to be known? When the self is known, what else is there to know or be known? To know all else without knowing oneself is ignorance, the unreal dreaming the unreal, while the reality knows solely itself. Regard self-knowledge alone as real knowledge. In knowledge, there is nothing else to be known. The knowledge of the self is the knowledge of all, and there is no all other than the self. In self-realization, being and knowing are one and the same. The ultimate wisdom is to be the self that you know. Knowing the self that you are, how could it be otherwise? True knowledge is direct experience. Beyond words and thoughts, direct experience is self-known. Neither dependent nor distant, the self alone has self-knowledge. Though devoid of the states of knowledge and ignorance, the Absolute alone can know the Absolute. It is within you. Within is being. Being knows itself. Knowing is being. Being is not doing. Action cannot lead to liberation. Self-knowledge alone is liberation. In self-realization, being and knowing are one and the same. Merger of the mind with consciousness supreme is superlative bliss. The thought-free knowledge, the natural state in which the possibility of delusion is no more. Be free from thought's definition, to merge beyond the mind in infinite consciousness, bliss divine. Be free from the notion of a second knowing entity, from the notion of a differentiated mind. Inquiry into the mind's own nature reveals consciousness alone, formless and unmodified, the mind's non-existence, thoughts' non-existence, the changeless, eternal consciousness. And this realization is the merger of the mind. Self-knowledge is liberation, and the path of self-knowledge yields liberation from all of the imagined bondage. In the self, even the cause of imagination is absent. The result of this knowledge is immediate freedom, no need of other light, no dependence on anything. Knowledge is essential and complete. Inquire to know the self within. You yourself knowing yourself. For the path of knowledge yields liberation, and self-knowledge is liberation. That you are the ancient spiritual instruction of the ancient truth. The meaning of you is the formless, egoless self. The meaning of that is the infinite, formless absolute. The meaning of are is identity. Negate all attributes superimposed on the self, and all the notions about the absolute, and realize their identity. One who knows the you truly knows that which is to be known, and that is the you, with no other you, for that you are. That is the self. That is the truth. And that you are. Supreme knowledge is oneness. The meaning of supreme knowledge is consciousness itself, eternal and self-known. The meaning of oneness is the vast, formless absolute, the inconceivable, secondless one. The meaning of is identity. Negate the known, all that is objective, which is unreal, and the only knower, the only knowing, remains as knowledge itself, which is absolute consciousness, knowledge supreme. There is no other knower, individualized or embodied. Consciousness, undivided, unformed, is itself supreme knowledge, and supreme knowledge is oneness. The self is the solitary reality. The meaning of this self is being, unborn and imperishable, non-individualized and unembodied. The meaning of solitary reality is the vast absolute, formless and infinite, eternal and undifferentiated, ceasing to misidentify the self with anything else. Yourself being the self, with no other self, you yourself abide as the self, non-dual, inseparable, neither divided nor united, the non-dual solitary reality, the one without a second. Know this self as it is, for the self is the solitary reality. I am the self is the truth of the I. The only real I, the I-less I of infinity, I that is true. The meaning of I is one's only own nature, true identity, unalloyed, non-objective, unconceived, non-individualized, the egoless I. The meaning of self is the formless reality, the vast absolute, transcendent of all definitions, qualities, and attributes, indivisible, homogeneous, indivisible one. Inquiring, who am I? Silently realizing no multiplicity of selves, only one indivisible I, the non-objective truth of the one self, the space-like self, with not a trace of another who exists. The self, only the self. Thus, I am the self. All is indeed the self alone. All is verily consciousness alone. Know all this universe to be of the single nature of consciousness. All this is the self, the only existence, the existence of all, without exception, the all-pervading, with no separate pervaded, the sole existence, with nothing apart, the very self itself, the self of all. The wave is only the water, the ring only gold, the snake ever only the rope. Nothing to form the wave, nothing to name ring, no imagination to hallucinate the snake. All in all, at all times. All is ever only the self. Nothing else is ever. This universe, only that. All this is, indeed, the self alone. Exquisite care and the most profound wisdom, preserved in scriptures, ancient and enduring, there for you to light your lamp, to be a marless mirror, to guide on a path, to awaken from an ages-long dream, to reveal what seems hidden, to fill your mind, to speak as a true friend, to turn you within to seek the self. The self, having revealed itself ages ago, before the beginning, is the silence that is, the source of them all. A scripture has no human author, for the one who writes it is identified with God, the one absolute, and the one who truly understands is the same timeless one. Who would have bothered to extol and explain the importance of realizing the God absolute, to describe such glory, bliss, and beatitude? If you could not realize this for yourself, follow the ancient path to the timeless truth within, as the wise who beckon are themselves that truth. The self within, who have composed the scriptures for its own revelation. Wisely realize wisdom, study and meditate with utmost care. The sacred text so preserved for this holy purpose with exquisite care.